Hello, my name is Y2BlockA. My ID is 150863 and I'm here to show you what I've been working on this block for the blueprinting objective. Here you can see that we have two blueprints communicating with each other and working with actual networking as I demonstrated just before. We start with the first one, that is the button. The button is really simple. It is just a cylinder set with a collision set to block all dynamics to generate overlap events, and same exact thing for the skull, because we're going to look for overlap events. Construction script is empty because we do not do anything in the editor with it. And as for the event graph, we just have a really simple button activation. We have our event any damage that, as you can see here, is already enabled for networking. This event set the instigating controller. In this case, it basically looks for the controller that is in the player that shot that target and is set it as the instigator. And once he has done that, he sends a message saying activate. And in this case, the message is looking for an interface. The interface is going to be placed in any receiving blueprint. So as you can see from the note here, if they do not contain the messaging event, nothing will happen. So in this case, our target is my statue that, as you can see here, is set as editable. So we're going to set this in the editor itself. I can show this. Here we have the voice saying my statue, and the statue is going to be the one that we have in the scene. You can choose it from the drop-down menu. We get the instigating controller as the instigator, and we activate the blueprint itself. So what happens in the statue instead is a bit more complicated. What happens in the statue is basically we're starting from here. Here we're activating our trap. Everything we're doing here is just calling the interface that is basically getting called by the statue just here, as we just saw. And everything we're doing after is being done only on the server, right? So what we're doing is we're setting the instigating controller as the instigator again, and we're just firing off two custom events that are closed statue and open statue that are just right here, and we're going to see in just a second. And we're firing them with a delay of 1 second between each other. So what do these events do? Open and close statue are two custom events, and this was the tricky part to figure out. They both run on multicast, and what you could figure out from looking at guides and tutorials on the internet is that you want to be using run on server because it's going to replicate everything automatically. But instead, the multicast event, as the description reads, replicates this event from the server to everyone else. That is actually the one that we want. So the server executes this event locally as well, and you only can call these events from the server itself. So that's basically fitting everything that we're doing here. So we're using this multicast on the custom event. What we're doing here is just basically setting the play rate of this timeline that is basically going to say how fast our timeline is going to execute. In this case, it's pretty fast because we want our statue to smash on the ground hard. We are activating and deactivating different sounds that are basically opening and closing door sounds, setting an authority as the server, and we're setting our boolean that is called is opening to false. This boolean is going to be used later on when we're going to check if the statue is closing or opening to decide if we're going to kill somebody touching the statue or not. So once we're done with this, we fire off our actual timeline, and the timeline is really simple in itself. It's just a curve of values that go from 0 to 1 for a duration of 1.5 seconds. So what the timeline is going to do is feed this curve to a lerf function that is going to achieve a really smooth movement with making it slow at the beginning and at the end. And the lerf function, the reason why the timeline uses values 0 to 1 is that the lerf function uses values to 0 to 1. So we're basically setting our 1 to our statue end height. That is basically just a float variable that is set by default at 300 units, but we made editable, so at any given moment we can go back to the editor, and if we click at the statue, it is currently actually set to 600. So this is going to override everything that is set in the blueprint when modified in the editor. So we set our lerp and we feed the result of the curve into our alpha. That is going to basically define the way the lerp is getting executed. And the result of this calculation is getting fed to the new location z of our set relative location function that is going to make move the statue, that is our target, is going to make it move on the z axis, so up and down. And everything we're doing afterwards is just waiting for the delay of this function and firing off the second function that is basically going to play everything on the contrary here with sounds, and then setting our boolean to is actually opening, because now the statue is actually opening up, and reverse timeline, not reverse from end, otherwise the animation would skip to the frame in which the statue is actually completely on the ground. We want it to reverse, so we're able to actually double shoot the statue, for example, and make it go up and down really fast, and not have weird animations, of course. So this is going to fire off the opposite timeline and play everything in the opposite direction. One final note on this: the cool thing of the timeline that we're using is that we actually need to use a timeline in this case, but it comes really handy because everything that happens after a timeline is actually getting replicated by itself, so it doesn't need it is not in need of any extra implementation for networking. Now we have our statue moving on the server, and we have our movement, sound, and booleans set with replication. Now what we need to do is kill people. So what we do is we create a really simple on component begin overlap that is basically going to check whenever this basic ladder that you can check in the viewport is basically a sticking out piece of geometry from the base of the statue, is going to look for any kind of collision events that happens between this collider and other objects in the world. And whenever these events happen, after of course setting the authority and making sure that this happens only on the server so everything gets replicated nicely. Whenever this event fires, we say we check for the door being opening. So as we said before, we set this boolean as false on is opening when the door was closing, because we wanted to check now, is the door actually closing down? So is it opening false? If yes, so if our statue is not opening, only if our statue is closing, otherwise we might have weird cases of death while the statue is going up. Only if the statue is currently closing down, we check if the collision has happened with a UT character, just to make sure that it's not a projectile or anything else. And if the collision has actually happened with a UT character, we apply damage. This function is also really handy because, as you can see, it's getting replicated automatically. Also, what we're doing is we're getting the instigating controller from the very start here and here. We are basically asking the blueprint who shot the target. And this really simple thing is just going to say who actually instigated the damage, and it's just going to give the kill automatically to the person that shot the target. And yeah, and at the end of this, we have the last call for a function that is our announce function. That is probably the funniest one. And our announce function works kind of in a really simple way. We have again our custom event set to multicast, again because we want it to be replicated everywhere and to everyone. And as you could see before, I had exactly the same effect with a true character when playing as the client and as the server, so it's verified it is actually working. So what we do is when announce fire, we activate a comment, and the comment is literally a component that has an audio track, a sound, and that is the sound that says Smackdown. And we toggle the visibility of these particles. These particles were actually customed by the author of this video. I've been working on them to create kind of the same effect that you would have when shooting a bullet in the middle of a forest. So we're activating all these 5 particle systems that are, if we look at the viewport, the particle systems are kind of spread around. You can see them, yeah, one by one. So they're kind of spread around to give the impression of being actually a storm of birds. So in any case, what we're doing is we call the event, we activate the comment that is just a component with an audio track, and on component being activated, we toggle the visibility of the particle system. So basically we spawn the particle system roughly. And we activate the flock bird sound, that is the sound of birds flapping their wings. And after 1.2 seconds, we toggle the visibility again, making the particle effect stop. So this is basically it for the statue and the button itself. Now we can go on and check the switch. That is basically what made the statue turn red when somebody jumped in it. So the switch is really roughly made. What I did with this was literally just creating collider boxes that would activate a component that is a spotlight. So because of the fact that using a capsule collider was making the entirety of the blueprint freak out, so I was forced to use several boxes to actually fit perfectly the statue itself. So basically these blueprint work in couples. Let's make it easier. So every 2 blueprints, what we're doing is we're checking if a component begins an overlap event. And if yes, component of course being one of the boxes, if yes, we set the intensity of the spotlight to 10,000. And whenever that overlap ends, we set the spotlight intensity back to 0. And we're doing that for every single box.